when you aren't writing the check yourself, you may know that the health benefit from your company is worth $10,000 a year to you, or $15,000. It may cost them that much, but it may cost the company that much, but you don't see it. So the company pays it, and most of the people in that waiting room sitting next to me, when they are not sitting there thinking about whether I can afford to do this, or what's this going to do. They're generally under some kind of a plan, not always, obviously, but they don't think that if the company wasn't paying them that, they could pay them to that in additional compensation. But of course, the weird system is the company gets a deduction if they pay it, but if you pay it yourself on a policy, I don't believe you get a deduction. So it's something that's most of the people are not seeing as a cost to them, and they like that pretty well.
No kidding.
Yeah, well, but that's true of the federal income tax. I mean, it was an act of genius from the standpoint of the government to go to a withholding system. And if you didn't, just think of how many people on April 15th would have to sit down and write a pretty good-sized check, and they'd be mad. They wouldn't like it, and they don't feel it now. So we were up. That's an obvious point, but you also, people like their doctor in general, and they don't like the fact that it's 17% of GDP. But one is just kind of a amorphous sort of thing, and the other is very, very real to them. And the most prestigious people in the community are on the hospital boards, and there's a lot of people that are fairly happy with the system. So we did not make inroads on that, and we are paying 17% of GDP for health care, and no major country is more than 11%. And in the pandemic, we've had a death rate or a death total as the percentage of population that's way higher than the rest of the world. Not every single country, but way higher. So we've laid out more money and gotten a poorer result in terms of this particular pandemic in terms of deaths per capita. Now, that may not turn out to be the...
Oh, Warren, even though you shot it and missed, you were at least shooting at an elephant. The cost of health care in Singapore is 20% of what it is in the United States, and their medical system works better. So you were shooting at a huge elephant. But as you found out, it's very hard to people to get very enthusiastic about losing part of their income.
Oh, yeah. No, I said we were fighting a tapeworm.
Yeah.
In the American economy, and the tapeworm won.
Yeah, the tapeworm,
Yeah.
That's good, wonderful phrase, the tapeworm.
This is a more general subject, but one of the subjects I might write about in one of the future annual reports is the problems caused by the myths that people have about their own organization. And I've seen that so many times in various forms. And to some extent, the problem has become accentuated in the last 20 or 30 years because the CEO often and works with the investor relations, and they say, well, we have to have constant contact with the analyst community. And of course, so they go on every couple of months and they repeat certain things about their company, and it becomes part of sort of the catechism. And nobody's going to go on 2 months after the CEO has said one thing and say, well, actually, that really isn't the way. They're not going to contradict themselves or change course. And so if you get these myths, and they can occur in a lot of different ways. I can give a lot of examples, which I won't do. As I tell my friends in corporate America, I really am not going to squeal on them. But there's a lot of mythology that gets handed down from one CEO to the next. Can the succeeding CEO say the guy that picked him, was on the wrong course, or he's been telling you something that isn't really quite true? He can't do it, And then he starts repeating it, and it leads to enormous errors. But it's hard to tell the story without giving examples, and I don't like to give examples. So we'll see when I write about it sometime. Charlie, you probably got some thoughts. He's had a ringside seat at a lot he's been on boards that I haven't been on. I mean, and it doesn't just extend to business. It goes beyond that into education and into, well, a lot of areas.
What's really interesting is the way you prattle out all the time. You're pounding back in even if it's wrong. And so one of my favorite remarks in the history of human remarks was by Sir Cedric. He said, "I have been a great actor for so long that I no longer know what I truly think on any subject. And so long that I no longer know what I truly think on any subject."
And it gets embedded in corporations.
Gets embedded and so on.
And the trouble is now the CEOs speak out so often, so if they've got some crazy thing that they're saying about their company and they keep repeating it, the subordinates aren't going to contradict it. And Charlie said they just believe it after a while, and it's dangerous.
Yeah, and of course the young people get these ideas after their liberal educations. Think that God has given them direct insights, and they're just as crazy as the politician.
Now, there's some old people that have them too.
Yeah, well, the old people are already crazy, but
they're going to die sooner. So,
well, the old people are already crazy, but
Why does Warren say Berkshire's ability to insure enormous risk quickly is a less valuable asset than it used to be?
well, because the demand is less. I mean, basically on that. If you take a period like happened after 9/11. I remember, I may be wrong on the details of this, but Cathay Pacific, for example, they couldn't land in Hong Kong, as I remember, unless they had an insurance policy by Monday of the following week. Well, we can do it. I mean, G calls me up, and he thinks of a price, and I think of a price, but we can do it. We can take the loss if it happens. They called us on the Sears Tower, I think, back then. After that, nobody knew on the Sears Tower, I think, back then. After that, nobody knew might be placed all over that. So, and they wanted more insurance all of a sudden, and we gave them a price. And so that thing, that sort of an environment hasn't really persisted. I mean, there were times, I think, perhaps AIG, when Hank Greenberg was there, he would do the same thing. But there weren't 10 or 20 people out there, and they needed big limits in some cases. And we were good for it. And they knew that if they bought the insurance and it happened, that we'd write a check and it would clear.
Senator Josh Hawley recently unveiled a new antitrust proposal that would ban mergers and acquisitions by firms with a market capitalization over $100 billion. While this legislation is unlikely to go through, increasing antitrust regulation could represent a material risk for Berkshire. Has Berkshire's board already discussed what would happen to the company over the long term if Berkshire was to be purchased?
Well, we don't discuss that as a specific, but the board is very, very, very familiar with what Berkshire does, why they do it, how we think in deploying capital. But we could, everybody knows that if you change the antitrust laws, it can change things for Berkshire. If they change the tax laws, it can change things for Berkshire. There's a lot of things, and we could spend hours discussing them. But in the end, is it a 22.3% risk that something changes? It's a good way to fill the time at board meetings. And if you're getting $300,000 or $400,000 a year as a board director, you might want to spend your time doing that. But we really don't focus on that. The main thing about Berkshire is how do you preserve the culture? How do you make sure that if you get the wrong person as the CEO, you can do something about it? That's the biggest risk a board has, is if you pick the wrong CEO. And I've been on 20 boards, and it's happened more than once. And sometimes it's a terrible problem to get rid of them. Years go by, and if a dissident comes in, it's one thing. But if you just sit there and you collect your $300,000 or $400,000 a year, and the chief executive keeps proposing you get an increase time to time, and it's worse yet if he's a nice person, doing his best. But we're not going to spend a lot of time we may do it on a personal basis, but we're not going to take a lot of people. And we want them to know more about what's going on with BNSF and how Katie's doing and whether the KCS thing can injure us in any material way and so on. And we really don't, except maybe on a private side thing, we don't start talking about, what the effects will be in 2050 if this projection or that projection is met. Charlie?
Nothing to add.